And hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for being here on this Sunday. It's Sunday evening, 7 p.m. here for me and 6 p.m. for Thunderous in Londinium. How are you doing, Thunderous? Great to have you.
Hi, hi everybody. Hi Lloyd. Hi to the listening audience. And yeah, things are fine here in the UK. Just watching with interest the elections that are taking place in this country in America and things happening in Europe and how Islam seems to be involved in every narrative around the world. Other than that, yeah, things are okay, I guess. How about yourself, Lloyd?
Pretty good. Is Islam involved in any narratives involving peace, peace settlements, peace agreements, peaceful things, or are they only involved in violence, defacing statues, tearing down things, assaulting people, beating up Jews, stabbing policemen in vital areas of their body?
Pretty much that's 1400 years of Islam, dude. Why was you expecting change?
Yeah, I guess I was being naive. I shouldn't
I
have.
think you're being optimistic. I think you're being very optimistic with a manifesto that is just pure hate speech. You can't expect anything different, mate.
Yeah, very much so. So yeah, let's. Yep. So now that we are discussing Islam, of course, today's session is to do part two of my discussion on the Quranic preservation myth, which of course Yasser Qadi, that he blew open that myth 4 years ago by claiming that by stating that that what were the famous the Quranic, the standard narrative has holes in it. So since then everyone has started digging and we're finding lots of holes, not because we're making them but because we're finding them. So it's metaphorical digging that he's finding literal holes, and Muslims cannot justify the myth of the preservation of the Quran, and modern scholarship proves this as well, because older scholarship, older Islamic records, the Islamic scholars themselves make it very clear there was a multiplicity of Qurans. Thank you, Sarah A. Much appreciated. So yeah, Thunderous, you've gone through my slides, you've managed to look through some of this stuff, and you said you had questions and you'd wanted to play devil's advocate or ask, questions. So if you want to start with that, with your thoughts on what you've seen so far.
Well, I think just going by the standard Islamic narrative up until recent years, where they've just basically said that there's only one Quran, it's not been changed, not a letter, not a word, not a dot, so on and so forth. We know the the response that Muslims give, and then obviously 4 years ago, the Western world was challenging that narrative. It became crystal clear as a result of Yasser Qadi's discussion with Muhammad Hijab that the narrative that they've been spilling to their own people as well as to the rest of the world has been a lie, a known lie, a hidden lie. But that has now been exposed, and because we have the sensation of the media and minds that have been very quick to take a copy of that recording and release it on their own website. So it can't be deleted from history. It's now in, for everybody to see on the internet. The curse of Islam has been the internet, and this is just another nail in the coffin of Islam. But the interesting thing in all of this is the rationalizations that the Muslim scholar for dollars, the Dawagandis and the Scholars are putting forward to try and say, well, there are, the Qira'ats in the Aruf, but it's still only one Quran. I mean, Yasser Qadi in that interview, even at the end of it, did say there's still only one Quran. They're all the Quran. They're all the one Quran. So a desperate rationalization to keep the theme of the Quran hasn't been changed, or not a letter, not a word, not a dot. That's desperate.
Yeah, I've done several talks myself, and then of course now with Chris at Speaker's Corner. And the evidence is very clear. There are multiple Qurans, as we've spoken with the audience. There are 7 approved readers, or 7 canonical readers, supposedly. There might be 10, there might be 14. Each canonical reader has 2 transmitters. So therefore, each one who was a canonical reader, in other words, version or editor or transmitter of the Quran, or primary transmitter, had 2 students, each student who transmitted that Quran. We know the 1924 Hafs Quran, which was created over 17 years in Cairo, Egypt. Why Quran would take 17 years when they could simply just copy the old manuscripts, which did not happen. The old manuscripts simply are not available to create a copy of the Quran word for word, letter for letter, dot for dot, because Islam does not have those ancient manuscripts. And 2, how come they didn't just take a reciter and have someone just from memory recite it and just write it down verbatim? Well, they didn't do that. They took one of the 14 transmitters, in this case Hafs. But of course, Hafs has 4 versions of the Quran. So Hafs doesn't even agree with his compatriot, his other student of the original canonical reader. And so they can't agree, but also Hafs doesn't agree with himself because there are at least 4 disputed versions of the Hafs. So yeah, very, very, very odd that it took them 17 years and they just picked one at random. Used no ancient manuscripts, used no memory recitation. They took one of the traditional readers, not even a primary, they took a secondary transmitter. Don't you find that a bit odd?
Of course, but then the whole narrative is odd. Where do you know it's odd from the start to the finish? And may I ask just one question that's been bugging me in all of this Aruf and Qira'at, right? When I did my discussion on 90 for Adam, it was clear that Adam in Islamic heaven spoke Arabic. So logic dictates that Arabic will be the first language on planet Earth, yeah, because that would have been the only language he knew. Now, when you go through Islamic genealogy, whichever ones you look at, the number of genealogies from Adam to Muhammad is normally between 21 and 23 generations. Now you have 72 from Adam to Jesus. So that's a numerical problem for Islam to begin with. However, just going back to the case in point with Arabic, if Adam spoke Arabic, logic dictates that when he spoke to Seth and his children in Islamic parlance, he would have spoken Arabic, correct?
Yeah, if that's the narrative, yes, that Adam
that's the narrative.
Was a prophet, and and God's language, Allah's language is Arabic,
Yeah, and Noah would have spoken Arabic. He would have only been a couple of generations in Islamic parlance from Adam. So at what point in history, in Islamic history, has there been a break in Arabic for Arabic? Because logic would dictate in Islamic parlance, Arabic would be the oldest language on earth. Why did it take so long, or in Islamic parlance, 21 generations for it to become a written text? Okay. Where was the break in Islamic parlance for Arabic to have disappeared from earth only to reappear for when Muhammad came? And we're talking about pure Arabic. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. Why is Arabic not the oldest language? Why are there no records of ancient Arabic dating back 6,000 years? And why are the early Arabic manuscripts in the defective text, which has no vowels, and has no of those dots which distinguish letters from each other, which means that they disambiguate the letters? So yes.
And I think people like Jay Smith, they use the term it's an evolving language or an evolving text. It shouldn't have been evolved. It would have been manifest in its purest form, because this would have been the direct language that Allah was speaking to Adam, and Adam was speaking to the angels when they started greeting and doing the greeting salutations to each other. So when Adam spoke to Eve, he would have used Arabic. When Adam and Eve spoke to Seth, they would have used Arabic, and Seth to know likewise, so on and so forth. And you've only got 21 or 23 generations, depending which genealogy you prefer to use. What happened to the Arabic language between Adam and Muhammad? What is the Islamic response to this? And
but
how
you're an
does it
Islamophobe.
reconcile? Sorry, it's part of my nature, dude.
I have no idea. I mean, they don't answer these things. They can't answer these things.
But do you not think it's relative to the discussion?
Yeah, of course. It actually is, and it's another area to highlight, to bring to them and ask them for clear, unambiguous answers, honest answers, because I think it poses another problem. Where's the ancient Arabic? Why was Arabic an evolving language if it's the oldest language? And how come it wasn't written down for thousands of years?
Yeah, and it was a pure language. In its purest form, it would have been Allah's Arabic when Adam hit Earth.
So how come the Bible was written in Aramaic and Greek and Hebrew, and not Arabic?
You've just led on. Thank you. You've just led on to the other problems that that they would have, because if Adam spoke Arabic, why do we have Hebrew? Where did the change in language come from? Who did the change in language? And why would Allah reveal other texts in other languages? Who's responsible for the confusion in languages? Now, we got a biblical response to this as far as the Tower of Babel is concerned. but we don't have a response in Islam as to why there are so many languages, and why, if Arabic was the first, why has there not been a consistent, if it's the purest language and the language of God, why is, and it would have been pure Arabic from when it hit earth with Adam, where did
Yeah,
it
they can
disappear?
say that a prophet was sent to everyone in their own language. Then we could ask, so how come Muhammad is the last prophet? How come everyone else got there first? Why? And if Arabic was the original language of Adam, why? Yeah, makes why Hebrew? Yeah, good question.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But the problem is, even if you turn around and say that they went to every nations, but then you got the other problem, which leads on to the 124,000 prophets, and the numerical problem we've got with dividing 124,000 between 21 or 23 generations. That's a separate discussion in itself and not
yeah.
relative to this.
Also, I'd
But
like Muslims
it
to tell me who
extends.
wrote, which scribes wrote each chapter of the Quran. We know it was collected together by, by one scribe, Zayd ibn Thabit, supposedly collated it or collected it. But who were the scribes that wrote each chapter? Oh, who were the scribes who wrote each chapter? We'd like to know. I mean, who wrote each one of these chapters that supposedly were collected by Zayd ibn Thabit? But tell you what, let's Protestant belief says where are the other 123,000 books of the other prophets? Yeah, you're
Maybe,
yeah.
maybe in the future we can do that. I did it on Reasoned Answers. Maybe I can do that on your show. Well, if we can collaborate on that one, Islam and 124,000
Sure. Yeah,
prophets.
let's do that again. Yeah. Yeah, it looks like I will be here next weekend. I was heavily busy preparing to leave. I was going to go on a 2-week road trip throughout Europe. And so I should get confirmation tomorrow, but at least 1 week of that has been cancelled, if not the entire trip, and has to be rescheduled, redone. So it looks like I'll be here. So I was going to be away for 2 weeks. So that's now suddenly changed. I heard on Friday. So yeah, Andy says it is called Islamic Standard Hearsay Narrative. Has holes in the narrative. Yep. Yeah. So tell you what, let's dive into the opening section of my talk now on the Qira'at, and let's listen to Dr. Haitham Sidney. Arnold Nathaniel says human writing can be traced back about 5,000 years ago, and alphabetical writing can be traced back to 3,700 BC. Wow. Approximately. Currently between 6,000 to 7,000 languages spoken across the world today. Yeah, and Arabic is a latecomer. Very, very odd. So let's start with this. This is Dr. Haitham Sidki, Quran preservation. He calls them lies to children from an interview he did. Let me play this. It's 1 minute long.
At least within Sunni Islam, there's a general belief that the Quran, from its origin, was multiformal, and what that means is that it was not one Quran, but there were many renditions, many versions of the Quran, and so different people have different conceptions as to where these variations come from. Is it, were they all uttered by the Prophet? Were some of them, did the Prophet, it's called Iqrar, did he hear them and he approved of them? Or were they generated by the companions, and so on and so forth? And unfortunately, actually, so I have heard some preachers that do say that there's only, one reading or one Quran or something like that. And, if I were to be very generous, I would say that falls under the umbrella of like lies to children, if that makes sense. That falls under the umbrella of like lies to children. That falls under the umbrella of like lies to children. That falls under the umbrella of like lies to children.
So yeah, I can get the feedback from you coming through.
Okay.
But hopefully you heard that as well, Thunderous.
No, I didn't. That's why I had it on my iPad. Sorry.
Sorry, did you manage to hear it though?
No, I heard it earlier on, so I got the gist, and I was reading the subtitles.
Okay, great. Yeah. So Haitham Sidki, this scholar, has openly called this discussion lies to children. The claims that the Quran has been perfectly preserved in only a single format, dot for dot, letter for letter, word for word. And I think we've already established that. I have in my discussion so far, as have others, established that there is no single version of the Quran, and there is no record of that in Islamic sources, that this is the case. This is a brand new claim, and it seems to be common since the Ottoman era, and it gathered strength when in 1924, the Hafs version of the Quran was printed and sent around the world by Egypt. So, yeah.
So I was just thinking, considering how late in history that this claim is, do you not, and considering in the 18th century the Bible was under so much scrutiny,
Right.
academically, historically, that this and certain inconsistencies as they would see it, because we're looking at a message, not word for word, that this was a bold claim by Islam. in order to give Islam credibility and the Quran credibility in comparison to the criticism that was taking place over the Bible?
Yeah, I think that question has been asked before, it has been raised, and it has from what I've seen from my research, yes, that does seem to be a reason why. It coincides with roughly the middle of the 19th century with the Ottoman Empire, who were sort of like at that point they were declining, but they favored the Hafs Quran, and because the Bible was being heavily interrogated, they all wanted to make the claim that the Quran is above suspicion. But as the scholar says now, it falls under the umbrella of lies to children. So yeah, okay. So let's go on to slide number 24, variant readings and of early authorities. So the variant readings of early authorities like Ibn Masud and Ubay ibn Ka'b were transmitted in scholarly literature through various means, right? These readings refer to differences in the recitation and wording. So here's what we know. Ibn Masud was one of the companions of Prophet Muhammad and a prominent reciter of the Quran. He had his own collection of the Quranic text, which differed from the Uthmanic Codex. Ibn Masud's variant readings were discussed and recognized within the scholarly tradition of Islam, particularly in Kufa, Iraq, where his readings were popular for at least a century. And that's the reference. You can go look this up. This paper on academia.edu, right? The legal epistemology of Quranic variants, the readings of Ibn Masud in Kufan fiqh and the Hanafi madhab. Ubay ibn Ka'b was another companion of Prophet Muhammad, known for his expertise in the recitation of the Quran. Like Ibn Masud, he had his own collection of the Quranic text, which also differed from the Uthmanic Codex. So these are companions of the Prophet Muhammad, and their versions of the Quran differed, which means you had early differentiations in the Quranic text. Ubay's recitation included additional phrases and variations in wording. His recitation was also recognized and discussed within the scholarly tradition. So these are the addresses to the papers if you guys want to look them up. Any thoughts, Thunderous, before I go on?
Well, because they were companions of the Prophet, they could not challenge the repute and reputation of these people, so they had to accept the readings.
But, of course, but unfortunately they did. They did challenge those readings. So, so they discarded these because Uthman wanted a single canonical version, and of course they burned the rest, which is very much what occurred in Egypt. So, preservation of variant readings, recognition and acceptance. So, the vast majority of Muslim scholars did not accept these readings due to their perceived weakness and the presence of strong reports indicating the opposite. So, there were hadiths that were indicative of issues between variant readings of the Quran. Right. The Uthmanic Codex became the primary reference for the recitation of the Quran because there was fragmentation in the lineage, in the transmission of the Quran from the very beginning. Multiple readings. Muslim scholars have clarified that these variant readings are considered to be authentic and part of the divine speech of Allah. So did Allah send the Quran down 7 times, Thunderous?
Well, no. I think we've got our own theories as to what was really taking place here. I think something, I don't know if you touched on it in your latter slides, but is there not a hadith where Muhammad is getting a revelation and somebody, I forget what the character's name is in the plot.
Yes, reminds him, and if he says, I forgot that.
Yes. Even suggests how to reword something. And Muhammad says, for all intents and purposes, says, yeah, go with that. That's a better way of saying it. So in effect, Muhammad's getting a revelation from Allah, and Muhammad's giving it to this guy to remember. But the guy says, actually say it in this way. And Muhammad says, yeah, go with that. So in effect, Allah's being corrected by the scribe. Do you remember the hadith? I
don't know which hadith it is. I will be discussing hadiths at the end. I'll be doing a separate section on hadiths. Because I didn't want that to be the focus. I wanted scholarship, and Muslim sources to be the focus, not the hadiths. Because every hadith suddenly becomes a weak hadith, right? So the companions relied on each reading that they heard from the Prophet Muhammad, which means that he was giving them variant versions as well. And they wrote them down in different codices so that both ways, both 7, 10, 14, 30 something, both ways would be available to Muslims. This resulted in regional codices with variations. Hold on. Both versions, that's 2, and now you've got regional codices with variations. And that's the Yaqeen Institute, and these guys are propagandists and lie mongers of the highest order.
That's what I meant when it says the companions relied on each other reading, each reading they heard from the Prophet, in as much that they were adding their own components, and that's where the changes were. So it wasn't a case of 7 Qira'at or how many Aruf. When they were writing it down or memorizing it, or memorizing it rather, that's where the changes are, because it was down to the individual person. Because if people are becoming followers of Muhammad in that period of time, they're not coming from one location, they're coming from various locations with their own sort of like dialects. So as they're recording this, they're recording it down in their own dialect, and when they're repeating it back to Muhammad, that's where the changes are. Is that a possibility?
Say that again, please. Sorry, I got distracted. So say again.
Okay, so Muhammad's gaining, if you like, a following, and as he's getting these revelations, he's revealing these revelations to various people who are memorizing them. But the people that he's revealing them to come from different locations within the Arabian Peninsula. So they have their own dialects, they have their own sort of like sub-language of Arabic. So when they're recording what Muhammad is saying, or memorizing what Muhammad is saying, they're memorizing it in a tongue that's unique to them. And that's where the changes are.
Right. Yeah. No, each one has their own personal memory. So the Quran has become very personalized, which I've already discussed. Someone mentioned Arabic from the 3rd or 4th centuries. So the system of dots and vowel markings, the diacritical marks, were gradually introduced in the 7th and 8th centuries only, which means that a word would have only vowels, which means it could be multiple words. We've taken the example of the letters CK in the past. You can't know if it's cake, cook, right? Cake or cook, those are two very different words, so you don't know. And there may be other words you can also make with that. Could be kaka, right? Those are very different words, so you don't know. So it was only in the 8th century that Arabic started to develop as a proper language, with diacritical marks. So there was a lot of confusion prior to that. So during the Caliphate of Uthman, other copies of the Quran were destroyed by fire, which means we had wrong Qurans, to ensure uniformity and reduce disagreement among Muslims. That's again from Yaqeen Institute. They're telling us there were disagreements over the Quran. Even the early companions did not know exactly. There were fights over who had the correct Quran. So it says here very disingenuously, the intention was not to eliminate variant readings, but to establish a standardized text. But you don't burn things you don't want to eliminate.
Only criminals do that.
Welcome, Century Since. Andy. So, key points about Uthman ibn Affan. Uthman ibn Affan, circa 573 or 576 to 17 June 656, was the third caliph. He ruled from 644 until his assassination because it's a religion of peace. In 656, Uthman was a second cousin and son-in-law to Muhammad. Here's a picture of him here in the background. As you guys can see, that's Uthman ibn Affan. True story. Uthman ibn Affan was a companion of Muhammad and an early convert to Islam. He was the third of the wrongly guided caliphs who ruled after Muhammad's death. He was among the first few people to accept Islam, being either the 4th or the 5th male convert. He married 2 daughters of Prophet Muhammad, Ruqayya and then Kulthum, after Ruqayya's death. During his caliphate, the Islamic Empire expanded through warfare because Islam's religion of peace. One of his major achievements was the standardization and distribution of the Quranic text in a single codex, known as the Uthmanic Codex, which we do not have today. So, also the Uthmanic recension. This was based on the master copy prepared during Abu Bakr's caliphate. He was assassinated in 656, leading to the start of the First Muslim Civil War, or War of Apostasy. He inherited the Codex, or Mus'haf, compiled during Abu Bakr's caliphate, which was in the possession of Hafsa, one of the wives of Muhammad. So, any comments on that before I move on?
No comments. Just it's an interest. The comparison that Christianity, when it started, they were willing to die for the cause, and here they are killing each other for the cause. The transition from one to the other.
Yeah, Aisha leading people into battle on her camel. Like, okay, yeah. So the prevalence of Hafs versus Warsh, all of this will tie in as we go. So the Hafs and the Warsh variants are two of the most widely used and accepted recitations or codices of the Quranic text today. The Hafs variant is by far the most prevalent, being used by around 90% of Muslims worldwide. It was popular under the Ottoman Caliphate, and of course the Egyptian 1924 Cairo edition was one version of Hafs. The Warsh is used by about 10% of Muslims, mostly North Africa. And these variants emerged from students or transmitters of the canonical readers who lived over 100 years after Muhammad. So these people created a Quran well after Muhammad's death, and then they chose these readers who come over a century after the Prophet Muhammad. Wouldn't they take an earlier Quran, the earliest Quran? Wouldn't that make more sense?
You mean very much like with Christianity, where the writers actually either knew Jesus or knew the people who knew Jesus?
Yeah. Whereas they rejected literal companions of Muhammad and and Uthman compiled his own version while rejecting versions that were known from actual companions of Muhammad. I find that suspicious. So both Hafs and Warsh are considered authentic transmissions of the Uthmanic Codex, even though they differ, which was compiled decades after Muhammad's death. So the differences between Hafs and Warsh are generally considered minor variations in just vocalization or pronunciation, tomato versus tomato, except as we've discussed and will discuss as we go, it's not tomato versus tomato or potato versus potato. It's tomato versus carrot, or carrot versus stick of dynamite, or tomato versus brick. So it's not exactly like they're telling us. They claim it's spelling differences or verse numbering, and others argue that there are substantive differences that change the meaning in certain verses, like Surah 2, 125. Hafs says, "You shall take." The Warsh has, "They have taken," or "they have made." Those are identical, word for word, letter for letter, dot for dot, right?
Not in the slightest.
What's the difference between "you shall take" and "they have taken"? Isn't that the same?
Well, one's more direct, isn't it, to a person, and the other one's more a generalization of a few people.
Yeah, so "you shall take," like Thunderous 1, "you shall take $1 million and put it in your account." Thunderous 1, "they shall take," not you, "they shall take." I'd say that's contradictory, right? And as Protestant Believer says, it's Bugs Bunny versus Wile E. Coyote. Yeah, those are two different characters. Right, then of course you've got Surah 3, 146. Hafs says, "fought," while Harsh has "were killed," in reference to prophets. That's exactly the same thing. Fought and were killed, correct? Identical.
You could not get more further apart than fought or killed, because fought is still alive. Killed, well, they're now deceased. So it's a totally different angle of where you're taking the context of that conversation.
Yeah, so Andy says clear contradiction. So however, now both variants are officially printed and accepted by institutions like the King Fahd complex in Saudi Arabia. The differences, they say, do not impact the core message of the Quran according to the majority Muslim view. Well, they're not allowed to contradict the Quran. They obviously cannot admit to the obvious. Now, this just resembles denial, propaganda, and damage control. So, Hafs versus Warsh, more on the textual variations. Over the centuries, various readings, the Qira'at of the Quran, have emerged. More of these versions have emerged, with the Hafs and Warsh just being among the most notable. So they reflect differences in pronunciation, dialect, and orthography, that's grammar and writing style and so on, that were already present in the early Muslim community. So let's have a look at some more differences between Hafs and Warsh. Right? So the Hafs and Warsh readings differ in several aspects. For example, we had already "you shall take," right? Watakizu versus watakazu, they have taken. You shall take, that's future, right? You shall. Whereas they have, that's past. Quran 2, 140, Hafs, taquluna, you say, versus Warsh, they say. You say, they say. Miskinin, poor person. Masakina, poor people. Protestant belief says Hafs was a known liar. Yeah, I didn't look into that particular one. It's been thrown around a lot, and we'd need some good references, but they would obviously say that if it was embarrassing to them that, because they claim that all of the Sahih Hadith are false, are misrepresented, are fake, are fabricated, are lies, because it's embarrassing to them. I don't see why they wouldn't say the same about Hafs. Hafs, as we said, has 4 different versions. So there's disagreement. Hafs is a companion to, rather, he's a student of a canonical guy who had 2 students. Hafs and the other guy don't agree either. And Hafs doesn't even agree with himself. Your thoughts, Thunderous?
No, Connie, so you've said it all there, dude.
Okay, I'll talk less and let you pick up the slack sometimes. Quran 3, 146. Hafs Katala fought. Warsh Kutila was killed. Quran 40, 26. Hafs Awan, or that. Warsh and that. So look, Thunderous, you can have $1 million, or you can have this Porsche and this house. Right? Or if I tell you, you can have $1 million and this house. Identical? The same?
No, one's a choice and one's a statement.
Yeah. And those are not the same. So yeah, these are, but apparently it's exactly word for word Allah's clear speech. Now my question has remained, which is the original Quran in paradise that Allah sent down? Or did Allah send 7 Qurans?
You know, the interesting thing is in this, there seems to be a lot of projection in this, and that's the summary, isn't it? That Islam is projecting their faults on the Bible, but the reality is when you look at the biblical narrative, whilst I agree there are different words, but the context of the sentence or the structure is pointed to the same thing. For example, if I may, if you go to 2 Timothy chapter 3 verses 1, it says in the last days, critical times, but that word could be substituted for dangerous times, precarious times, hostile times. So you're still saying the same thing. Yep, but the Muslim would turn and say, well, you've got different versions of the Bible, but the message of the Bible is still the same. It doesn't change anything as far as context is concerned. But when we go to the Quran, a sentence can change the whole context of the structure. And
yeah, the difference is that we say that the Quran was, Muslims say, sorry, that the Quran is the literal speech of Allah, the literal speech. So if it's the literal speech of Allah, how is it multiple different versions, different words, different grammar, different context? But the Bible we know is translations from inspired speech.
Yeah, and there's another word there, terrible times. So that's a word that I hadn't used, but there's another. But it's still, the context still says the same thing. And the thing is, even that in itself is quite problematic when it says that it's the literal speech of Allah, yet it's uncreated. It's the uncreated speech of Allah. How can speech be uncreated by God? That means it must be co-existent with God and co-eternal with Allah.
Right.
If it's uncreated, and then which version of this uncreated speech or this Quran do they have in Islamic heaven? And why is this book, this one, the only one that's in Islamic heaven and not any other of the revelations that are supposed to have preceded it?
Why didn't Allah just send this one down to begin with? If this is his words from before time.
Well, and the other thing is as well, so I don't want to go on a tangent, but if I could just ask you the question, why do you think, or what explanation is there that for the 24 years that it's taken to have this revelation sent down from Allah's heaven to Muhammad? And then you have over 100 years before it's compiled. So it's taken Allah 124 years to get this book, and it was known as a book at the time when it was being revealed to Muhammad, because certain ayah have it as this book, but it wasn't a book. It wasn't a book until about 124 years later. What's the rationale on that?
You tell me. I mean, yeah, how come it lasted 17 years from 1907 to 1924 to create a proper copy of the Quran?
Then that's going over 1,000 years.
Yeah, and it actually does go back. It goes back more than a few weeks, right? I mean, if they have the literal speech of Allah, what was the literal? They don't have the Uthmani Quran, and they don't have Muhammad's original Quran.
No,
they don't. They've got neither of those. So whose Quran is it? Muhammad's Quran they're looking for? Is it Uthman's Quran they're looking for? Or is it Hafs? Hafs came 100+ years later. And Protestant believers says, yeah, it's unbelievable that people actually believe that nonsense. I know it's incredibly confusing. It makes zero sense. So let's jump back into.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. No, that's good. No, these questions are good. Please throw in all your thoughts. It's actually good for people to ask these questions, because you might ask questions that, I mean, let's not assume that my information is 100%, correct. Ask questions. Let's test it, right? So, so of course you've got whoever this guy is. Of course, it's created. Isn't in a book form. Ha ha ha! Laugh laugh laugh. That's not the argument Muslims make. They claim it is uncreated, and they claim that the Quran today, and of course, if you burn it, will kill you. That's the standard Muslim claim because Islam's religion of peace, and they murder anyone who burns a Quran. They'll tell us that the Quran is the perfectly preserved, word for word, dot for dot, letter for letter copy of Allah's perfect speech. Except you've got at least 14 different variants of it, if not many more. So the Quran is no kind of guideline. The Quran is merely a guideline in achieving a godly conscience. It's not a God itself, really. So is this person even... You know what? I'm going to put you in timeout because I think you're talking a bunch of poop. I'm going to stick you in timeout for a while. So I can do without the nonsense. Okay, let's have a look here. Let's go to the next one. Katala, fort. Right, Quran 43:19. Haf says ibad or ibadu, slaves. And the Warsh says inda, with. So slaves versus with. I'd say that's more than a tiny variation myself. Your thoughts?
No, absolutely. I mean, you'd have to ask, going to the ayah, what is it? What's trying to be? What's the thought or the message trying to be conveyed there? If one word is slaves and the other one is with.
Yeah, who knows? The Quran isn't supposed to make sense. So now these variations are not just phonetic differences. They're not tomato versus tomato. They're not potato versus potato. How do you say potato, Thunderous?
I say potato.
I say potato too. So it's Americans that say potato, right? Or potato. Does anybody? But that's the same word, same spelling, correct? Just a minor pronunciation difference.
Yeah.
But if we have potato and Allahu Akbar, stab him with a knife, is that the same phrase?
No, not in the slightest. And the thing is, with I can say pronunciation, you can tend to go with potato. The listener will know the thought that you're trying to convey with what you're saying there.
Yeah, I hope so. So thank you very much, Crusader General. Let me just bring this up. Thank you very kindly. The Quran is a da'if hadith. Yes, it is. It is extremely da'if. I have to agree. Thank you, and thank you very much. Much appreciated for that. Yeah. So Muslims conquered and dominated lands from Arabia to Spain. Since they were dominant, why are there not numerous examples of early Qurans, 6th century examples, as is the case with Bible fragments? That's a very fair... Let me bring that up as well. Let me just load that. That's a very fair question. What are your thoughts on that? From Arnold Nathaniel. If they traveled all over Europe. I mean, they were in Spain in the 7th century. They were in France in the early 8th century. In the 700s, early 700s, they had to be kicked out of France. I mean, the French never invaded them. They invaded France. Why aren't there numerous examples of early Qurans? Why aren't people writing about these Qurans back then already? Your thoughts?
No, that's a very, very good question. To be fair, that you would see some kind of evidence or manifestation or historical examples of as Islam spread, the message in whatever form written down would be there'd be like where's the Quran's Dead Sea Scrolls?
Thunderous. Oh my god, the Quran Sea Scrolls. The Red Sea Scrolls. Where are the Red Sea Scrolls? Yeah, good question. So hello, who found it? And that's Connor. Welcome. Good to see you. Yeah, that's a great question, Thunderous. Okay, so the differences in the Quran can be traced back to the oral traditions of a recitation and the early Islamic practice of conveying the Quranic text without a fully developed system of diacritical marks, which means their alphabet was consonants only, which means you can have ambiguities, and you could mistake one word for another. Like the letters CK could be kaka, could be cook, could be cake, right? As I mentioned here, you could have these differences. So you have CK and you end up with kaka. Which word is it? You don't know.
And this goes back, that it was when I went through this material earlier, that was a thought that came to my mind about Adam would have spoken pure Arabic. So we shouldn't have this problem now. In Islamic parlance, whatever their time span is, as far as when we go to the biblical narrative, it's 6,000 years of human history, but we don't know what in Islamic parlance, what time span we've got here. It'd be relatively short because there's only 21 generations. So it would, I don't understand how, if Arabic was the first language on earth, it's not an evolved language. This is a language that's devolved. It's gone backwards, not forwards.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't have to evolve if it was the first original perfect language of Allah, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
I
it's gone
mean,
backwards, not forwards.
as Haitham Sidki said to us, as he said here,
falls under the umbrella of like lies to children. Falls under the umbrella of like lies to children. And if I were to be very generous, I would say that that falls under the umbrella of like lies to children, if that makes sense.
let's just replay.
One reading or one Qur'an or something like that. And if I were to be very generous, I would say that that falls under the umbrella of like lies to children, if that makes sense. That falls under the umbrella of like lies to children. That falls.
Yeah, that's Dr. Haitham Sidki on the view of a single preserved Quran. So, okay, so the narrative and the broader implications. So the difference between Hafs and Warsh does raise questions on the impact, questions about the impact on the Quran's narrative. So most variations do not significantly alter the core messages or doctrines of Islam. That's great. But they do show textual diversity that contradicts the claim of perfect preservation. And then you have differences that are contradictory. You have differences that are not the same, clearly lean in totally different directions with different meanings. So changing the subject from you to they in verses affects the directness or general applicability of guidance. I want you to do this. I want them to do this. They should versus you should. Those are not the same in meaning. Tony says, if the first language, then what are the origins of the other languages? That's a fair point.
Well, that's what I was asking earlier on. We know the thing is with the Torah, Babel, and the Bible, so we know what the origin is there. But Islam has no explanation as to how languages evolved, none at all, which raises further issues because as I was saying earlier, if Arabic is the first language, and it would be because you go to the 90-foot Adam and Adam being expelled from earth. From heaven, we can see a clear dialogue between Adam and the angels because they're talking about the greeting and the response of that greeting, which is in Arabic. So Arabic would have been the first language on earth. Arabic would have been the language Adam used with Eve. Arabic would have been the language used with Seth. Seth would have learned that language and spoken to Noah, so on and so forth. So that would have been a perfectly preserved language from, depending, like I said earlier, between 21 generations or 23 generations. So there's not that much in a way from Adam to Muhammad as to why languages broke, or well, we know from the biblical narrative why languages got introduced, but we don't have an explanation from Islam how different various other languages got involved and how Arabic as a language went backwards, not forwards.
So here's Adam's grave. Thunderous, just so you know, this is the grave of the Prophet Adam.
That's just bizarre. It's pathetic. I remember seeing that before. When I did my discussion on 90 for Adam, I didn't even use this as an example. It would have insulted my discussion.
Yeah, he was tall and incredibly thin. He had a single width. Oh my God, he was built like this all the way from one end to the other. I mean, you'd think that. Yeah, how thin was his ribcage, man? The grave of the Prophet Adam. True story. True story. Damian Kuzmich, welcome. God bless. LOS Strategy says this is definitely a fascinating journey of study on. Really enjoying it, though. I do really wish you still taught Piper. Yeah, that's discussion for another day. So, yeah, so yeah, that's there you go, the grave of Adam, people. It's on YouTube, and you can, and in fact, there's more than one grave of Adam. If you guys are interested, there's more than one grave, right? Here you go. Here's the other grave of Adam. So Adam and Eve's grave. So let's go have a look at the grave of Adam and Eve. Here you go, people. Oops, the graves of Adam and Eve. True story. True story. What do you think, Thunderous?
It's like I said, when I did my discussion years ago on 90 for Adam, I wouldn't even introduce these. I felt that they were insulting to my discussion on the subject. But it was just a joke. It's offensive to people's intellect that a human being could be so tall and so thin.
So yeah, yeah, that's just very very weird. I mean, people obviously not exactly. People are saying like this reminds me of those circus performers. Yep, dragon. Yeah, it's hysterical. Exactly. Adam's graves in many different cities looks like a pile of toothpicks. Adam must be good at picking oranges. I get no doubt. Giraffe Adam. Dragon. Yes, they did put them under X-ray, and if you don't believe them, you're a bigot. So yeah.
Maybe in the future on this channel you'll allow me to do the my discussion of 90 for Adam and how I think it was Ali Sina put out a Photoshop of a fake finding a 90 for Adam and how the headline was Jews found the evidence of 90 for Adam. I've got the image.
Yeah.
Maybe we can do
No,
a
let's
discussion on that.
by all means. I'm sure there's other graves of Adam as well that we can find. So yeah, I mean, so we'll have a look at that. Yep. Let's continue. Look, Saturday. How are you for next Saturday? Seems like we'll be in Warsaw. So you're good for Saturday next week. We can discuss afterwards.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
scholars
we-
within Islam have acknowledged, and this is a long known issue. Scholars have historically acknowledged these variations, claiming that the multiplicity of readings is a feature of the Quran's preservation. So this goes back to the very beginnings of Islam and to the major scholars at the start of Islam. So they say there are different versions which make it accessible, easy to understand by people. So, the smart people have a smart version. The not so smart people have a not so smart version. The easy people who need an easy version have one, and the technical people have a technical version. And cultural context, so it fits across different linguistic and cultural contexts in the Muslim world. And Prophet Muhammad approved multiple recitations as long as they did not contradict the Quran's core teachings. I thought it was one version, word for word, dot for dot, letter for letter. So yeah.
I see that for me is problematic because that for me suggests that Muhammad was probably getting these revelations, giving them to some of his followers, and the followers were probably writing it down, or recording it, or memorizing it in their own way. And for the sake of expediency, he just accepted it and gave approval to it.
Yeah. Yeah. So now, the versions, as I covered previously, these different versions of the Quran, and I probably will touch on that again, these different versions of the Quran seem to suit various theological agendas. So the different versions seem to suit a particular school or sect's view of Islam. So they created a version of the Quran that suits their theology. This is where the differences seem to lie. And I will come back to that again. I covered that when I was doing my talks with Chris at Speaker's Corner. So this basically, we need to go back and rethink the process of Quran canonization and the claims of divine inspiration versus human stewardship. This is the humans who were receiving this thing, and then what they did with it. How did they edit it? How did they pass it on? So let's look at Ibn Mujahid in Baghdad. Shouldn't we be looking at Ibn Mujahid in Mecca or Medina? Why Baghdad, of all places? So Ibn Mujahid, full name Abu Bakr Ahmad ibn Musa ibn al-Abbas ibn Mujahid al-Atashi, was an influential Islamic scholar from Baghdad. He lived from 859 to 936. That's about 2 weeks after Muhammad died, right? Thunderous? Who is that?
That's a good 150 years, isn't it?
Yeah, 936. Muhammad died in, supposedly 632. So this is 304 years
sorry, I was
later.
looking at it.
Yeah.
I was looking
The
at
beginning
phone.
date, yeah.
Yeah.
So even if you look at this date, it's still 220 years after the death of Muhammad that he was even born. How come this guy recanonizes the Quran more than 2 centuries after Muhammad died?
Yeah, this is the problem that they try and label against the Bible, isn't it? People recording things in a certain period of time. We're a lot closer with it.
And this is a good point here. Very good point. What do you think, Thunderous?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, so exactly, yeah. Okay, so now he's most renowned for canonizing the 7 primary methods of reciting the Quran. In other words, the 7 primary versions of the Quran. Understand versions. right? He wrote a work called the Kitab al-Saba fi al-Qira'at, or the 7 in readings. The 7 canonical readings, he said, were those of Nafi al-Madani, Ibn Kathir al-Makki. Now, Ibn Kathir is famous. Abu Amr al-Basri, Ibn Amr al-Damashqi, Asim al-Kufi, okay? Asim is where the Hafs reading comes from. Hamza al-Zayat and al-Kisai. His work standardized and supposedly perfectly preserved these multiple authoritative methods of Quranic recitation transmitted from the era of the Prophet Mo and his companions. It's quite obvious they'd forgotten what the original was. They didn't know what the original was. There was a multiplicity of versions, so they kept them all just in case. Would you agree with me, Thunderous?
Absolutely.
So, Ibn Mujahid is born in Baghdad. He studies Hadith and Quranic sciences under renowned scholars of his time, becomes an expert in Quranic recitations and exegesis, teaches a large circle of students in Baghdad before dying in 936. In the first half of the 4th century of Islam, the 10th century in our time, Ibn Mujahid, being the influential imam of the readers in Baghdad, publicly and with government support, brought this process of Quranic variation to its logical conclusion. Actually, that's a really good point. Thank you. I'll just make a couple of notes here. I just want to bring this up. Thank you for that. Damashqi is Damascus. Thank you. A.A. Maxi, we don't know if Muhammad was illiterate. His alleged illiteracy is not attested in the Quran. Yes, but it is the claim Muslims make, so we have to hold them to their own claims, right? And it is plausibly an apologetic claim. How could Muhammad have known all these things? Exactly. I agree with you fully. No one, I think, these days believes, and even the Hadith slip up and say that Muhammad could write. But we've got to hold the Muslims to their claims. Would you agree that's sensible, Thunderous?
Yeah, I would. The only thing is I would tend to go along with the illiteracy side because logic would dictate if this is a message from Allah, he would have taken it would be incumbent on anybody who's claiming to be a prophet and that this is going to be the last message to actually write it down. So if he could read and write, I would expect him to be able to have written it down, which is one of my criticisms of I think there was a letter alleged letter, I don't think it's a real one, sent to a certain leader inviting him to join Islam. I forget what that guy's name was. But my criticism was that they had the presence of mind to write a letter inviting this world leader to come and join Islam, but no one had the presence of mind in Muhammad's lifetime to write down the Quran. I find that very suspicious. So I would go along with the narrative of that he was illiterate, but also when he was in the cave reading the Revelation and he was asked to read, he says, "I don't know how to read." So,
right, yeah. I mean, look, yeah. There's one point I wanted to make on that is that there is evidence that if you look at the way the Bible is transmitted within the Quran, many scholars lean towards that it seems to be orally received stories, but also these are not clearly Orthodox Christian teachings. These are variant teachings. These are Gnostic teachings. These are myths and children's tales that are in there. So yeah, the story is not clear. Yeah. Yeah,
and the thing is, he is also known as Ears, and he buys stories. So that all leads me to believe that everything about Muhammad was oral. No sexual implication in that comment.
Very good point. Well said. Well said. Thank you for that. Yes. He's all ears. So now notice, Ibn Mujahid, with government support, right, bans further use of the variant readings of Ibn Masud and other uncanonical readings. How can you call Ibn Masud uncanonical if Ibn Masud was one of the close companions of Muhammad or was very close to Muhammad, right, to the time or within the group of people that were close to Muhammad, for instance? Right, so now you have another Uthmanic activity taking place where they go, oh, well, there's too many differences here. We've got to make one more variant. Right? And so, now, what he does is there's a guy called Ibn Shanabut, a contemporary and a fellow reader of Ibn Mujahid, in other words, a fellow Quranic reader. He complied with this ban only after he had been arraigned in court and then flogged in public. They beat him so that he would comply.
You will be assimilated.
Yeah, we are the Borg, and you will be assimilated, exactly. So that's exactly what happens here. So clearly people were definitely going along without violence, right? Because Islam's the religion of peace. They just had to beat up one guy with a whip to make him give up his version of the Quran. So, who's fooling who? Orthodox Muslim scholars such as Muhammad Qutb and his disciples believe that it is against the Islamic faith to question the Quran because it is the book of God. Now we look at William al-Sharif, the Rethinking Quranic Studies. He says Muslim scholars such as Al-Qasim ibn Salam, who died in 839, that's a few weeks after Muhammad died, Ibn Qutayba al-Denuri, that's like, these are 200 years after Muhammad, and Ibn Mujahid, 936, that's 300 years after Muhammad, mention different readings of Quranic verses, though they believe that the Quran is literally fixed in a preserved board, the Allah al-Mahfuz in heaven. So if there's a fixed, preserved tablet, why do we have multiple versions on earth? Right? It is noticeable that they accept or reject certain readings in accordance with their theological positions. And I think that's what's important here.
That's it. They've got a presupposition.
So yeah, to overcome problems pertaining to different readings, Sunni scholars reported prophetic sayings, hadiths, which state that Allah recommended the different readings. Why would Allah want different readings if Allah has one set of words that says exactly what Allah wants everyone to follow? And he says there is no authentic document to tell us why only 7 readings were permitted. Muslim scholars claim that 7 readings were permitted because of the 7 dialects of the 7 major Arab tribes. They claim there were different readings because of the nature of Arabic script. In fact, there are more than 7 tribes and there are more than 7 dialects. So why those 7? Yes, Allah knows best. He says no one knows for sure why some dialects were accepted and others rejected. Wow, Mirella, thank you. New donation from Mirella. Thank you very, very much for that, Mirella. And then it says there are not 7 systematic readings of the Quranic text. For instance, Shihab al-Din al-Damyati's Itaf Fudala al-Bashar speaks of 14 readings. And we've already discussed there's far more than 14. Your thoughts, Thunderous?
No, I was just thinking, was it possible that they chose the 7 based on the more prominent of the dialects?
We don't know. We don't know that that's the case. Actually, no. I'll get to those details in a minute. So yeah, I will get to those. Yeah, we don't know. That there's no clarity on this. It's actually not as clear as they would like us to believe. So have a look at the Encyclopedia of Islam, Volume 5. So it says here that, of course, we've mentioned this guy who was Shanabud, who was arraigned and flogged. In addition, this is from the Encyclopedia of Islam. This is the gold standard Islamic academic text, in historical text. Ibn Mujahid declared the reading of the Uthmanic consonantal text standardized by tradition and consensus to be obligatory, and compelled Ibn Miqsam, another fellow reader, to renounce the claim that he could decide for himself on the punctuation and vocalization of the text. So in other words, people had the view, and this was not that uncommon, that they could decide how the Quran was to be interpreted. They had their own versions.
So they were basically doctoring Allah's own words.
Yeah, exactly. They had private Qurans, just like Ubay ibn Ka'b and others. And he says here that Ibn Mujahid recognized 7 readers belonging to the 2nd century, the 8th century in our time, AD. Why would he take 2nd century versions? Why not 1st century versions? Because I thought it was written down at the time of Muhammad.
That doesn't make sense. That certainly contradicts the statement, doesn't it?
Yeah, and he says among whom were Asim of Kufa, Nafi of Medina, whose readings have both remained authoritative. So why Kufa? Okay, why not one version from Medina or one version from Mecca? I find it very strange. It's like saying, well, we're going to support we're going to take the Icelandic version of the Bible because we don't find the Jerusalem version to be trustworthy. So we're going to use the one we have in Iceland, and there's one in Argentina, and there's one in Tierra del Fuego, just before you get to the North Pole, that's used by some Eskimos. We like that version. We're going to use that version of the Bible. So now we've got 3 different versions of the Bible because that Jerusalem thing, it doesn't work for us. So wouldn't that be something like that, Thunderous?
It's getting that way, eh?
So to the 7 readers recognized by Ibn Mujahid were added later on 3 others. So hold on, you had 7 versions, then 3 more versions are added that are authentically Allah's speech, and then another 4. And then Ibn Mujahid, in mentioning Asim, one of the 7, had often named 2 others. So Ibn Mujahid mentioned Asim, right? of Kufa as one of the readers, and Asim of Kufa had mentioned he has 2 students who are transmitters. Abu Bakr, Shuba, right? Oopsie. Yeah. This camera does these weird things when I just disable that nonsense. So you guys don't have to see my... Wait, who wants to see my... That's my background. That's my jacket lying on the spare bed. And yeah, just so you guys know. Okay, back to that. So you've got Abu Bakr, Shuba, from 809, which is nearly 200 years after Muhammad died, and Hafs, who died 796, who transmitted Asim's readings independently. Remember I've said that Hafs has 4 versions. 4, not 1, 4. It became customary to add also the names of 2 other students to the other canonical readers. So now you've got 14. You've got 7 plus 3 plus 4. So that's 14. So now you add 2 more transmitters. That's 14 plus 28. How many is that, Thunderous? Is that 42?
It's got more builders than the Tower of Babel.
So, AM actually says you are using your brain, Lloyd. It's Islamic hikmah. You will never understand. Leave it. You're right. And he says, thus originated the bewildering number of names in the list of readers recognized as canonical. Because now you have 42 versions of the Quran. 42 so far. So King's Facepalm says, a game of telephone spanning centuries in different languages and cultures, 100% accurate. Trust me, bro. Exactly. Your thoughts, Thunderous, before I go on?
No, it's being covered, dude.
So this, however, did not rule out the uncanonical, deviant, or shawad readings. They were later adduced as useful evidence in the practical interpretation of the Quran and in the elucidation of linguistic problems. What? They had linguistic problems in the Quran, which is Allah's clear speech, which is one Quran, which is lies for children, which is preserved dot for dot, letter for letter, and word for word. So they could not completely rule out uncanonical, deviant readings. So we have 42 variants, plus they can't rule out deviant readings. So how many are we at now? Who knows? Your thoughts?
No, that was just it. How many versions are there?
Yeah, they said a bewildering array, right? They said a bewildering number.
Bewildering is a serious number in itself. If somebody says a bewildering number, that should tell you that's quite a significant number. Because the very word bewildering means that you're flustered, aren't you? You're confused.
Dragon, how many is bewildering? What number is bewildering? 72? Because maybe the Muslims seem to like the number 72. So, yeah. So, okay. So about the Hafs reading. So in this, he says here, this is another book that says, in this connection, it becomes this is Encyclopedia of Islam, Volume 5 as well. It becomes understandable that the official Egyptian Quran of 1924, following the reading of Asim in the tradition of Hafs, is not founded on early Quranic manuscripts because there are none they can use. But it is the result of reconstructions derived from the literature on the readings. In other words, tradition that was common to a particular group. Your thoughts, Thunderous?
No, I was just nodding my head in total agreement on that.
So, about Hafs. In this connection, it becomes understandable that the Egyptian Quran of 24, right, is the result of reconstructions, not from texts, but from picking one version from one transmitter, who himself cannot agree with himself. So, Dragon says Islam will end as a small sect, Islamic sources, and of course, and it will disappear like a snake slithering between the two mosques. Yes.
Well, the interesting with what Dragon was saying there, I was actually going to mention it earlier on, because if you consider how many Qurans would there be if it's bewildering, I would say for 73, one for each sect of Islam that Muhammad prophesied would happen, and there's only one true Islam, which would be the very small number that you're talking about now.
Very good point. Like a serpent. Yeah, very good point. So let's have a look. So the official Egyptian Quran of 24 and its relationship to reconstructions derived from literature on the Quranic readings. I think this is the name of the paper. The official Egyptian Quran of 24 is based on the reading of Asim in Hafs, right? The choice was made by scholars who worked on the project, and it became the standard method of recitation in Egypt. It's recently been replaced by the Warsh. The goal of the project was not to reconstruct the ancient form of the Qur'an, but rather to preserve one of the canonical Qira'at readings, specifically the Hafs and Asim version. Fascinating. They didn't have texts to use. They didn't have an early Quran to use. They just said, okay, heck, we're going with Hafs because we like him. The choice of the Hafs and Asim of the official Quran was influenced by several factors. Hafs was popular during the Ottoman period and it was familiar in Egypt. You wanted to say, Thunderous?
No. It's just not in agreement.
No, it's one Quran. It's 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus... Stop me when I get to 42. Plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 is equal to 1. So, the Hafs reading is considered easier to teach and learn compared to other readings, which may have contributed to its selection. Also, Max is maybe Hafs sounded more poetic. That is a possibility.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's all down to comprehension, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe. Guys, Thunderous is a fantastic guy. I've met him. He's awesome. He's very good looking, very athletic. Looks heck of a guy. Wish I could hang out one more time. And in fact, Century Since was there with us. It was a great time. No alcohol required, although we did have some. And, great old British pub. So, yeah, please do support his channel. And thank you for subscribing, Jordan Freeman. Yeah, so do subscribe to his channel. Do give him a visit. And if you like what I'm doing, please do like, do share, do subscribe. A significant number of my followers and viewers don't actually subscribe. So do like, do share, and let people know. I've put out some very short videos on the Nazi connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, and of course Hamas is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is connected to Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was an ally of Hitler, and of course Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, was a big fan of Adolf Hitler. So we need to let people know that the Palestinians, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Hamas were founded on Nazi principles. They were literally founded on Nazi principles. And the Palestinians were Nazis. Quite honestly, historically, they were. I've covered this before. Got some short videos, new stuff, and I've got some more coming out. So yeah, thank you guys. So the scholars involved in the project aimed to produce a fixed text based on one pre-selected reading rather than examining manuscripts and comparing variants to determine which one is truly canonical. They don't know, so they said, well, bugger that, we're just going to go with this one. Basically, this was like, excuse my French, but they were saying, fuck it, we don't know, we'll take this one.
Yeah.
Am I wrong, Thunderous?
No, you're bang on point with that. You can see that historically with what you, all the information you provide in there. That's exactly what it lends itself to.
Yeah, I mean, basically they just put numbers in a hat and picked one and said, it's Hafs or whatever. So let's take the 7, the 3, and the 4. So the 7 readers were recognized by Ibn Mujahid in the 8th century. Remember, this is he died in the 9th century, right? 936. So this is 300 years after Muhammad died, right? So you're looking at the 7. Ibn Amr at Damascus, died 736. Ibn Kathir, okay? So Muhammad dies in 632. So this is the closest version, the next closest version when this guy's born, right? Nafi al-Madani, 689. Abu Amr of Basra, 689. Hamza al-Zayyat, 699. That's like looking at 70 years almost after Mo died. Asim ibn Abi al-Najud, 700, 70 years after Mo died. Al-Kisai, 737, that's 100 years, 105 years. Later on, 3 more readers are added. Yaqub al-Hadrami died 205 AH, so this is 200 years after Mo died. Then Khalaf ibn Hisham, 230 years later, and then Al-Yazidi, 200 years. Okay, fantastic. After that, 4 more readers to make 14 recitations. Abu Jafar died 130, right? That's 130 years after Hijrah. So that's what, 620, so that's 110 years after, after that, and it's 110 years after Mo died. And it's 100 years after Mo died. Ibn Jamaz, okay, Yazidi, Harith. So the original 7 were expanded to 10, then 14 recitations. And the 7 readers recognized by Ibn Mujahid in the 8th century are apparently, supposedly, the most famous and widely used. Notice, does anyone see Hafs in this list? So no, it's not Hafs because Hafs comes from one of the versions that we've got here. right? So after the Uthmanic Codex, the Shawad that contradicted it were viewed as shad or anomalous readings no longer acceptable. But they could never quite rule out these Shawad versions, these anomalous readings, these other variants, because, well, they didn't quite know. Most versions of the Quran are in the Nile, says Jimmy English. That's really good. Yeah. Any thoughts, Thunderous, before I go on?
No, well, the only thing that was coming to my mind as you was reading that out is that Muhammad himself said that the first 3 generations of his time were going to be the best ever race from Islam. And I'm thinking, well, surely if they were the best 3 generations, the first 3 generations are going to be the best Muslims ever. Why are we waiting hundreds of years before things are being written down and compiled and canonized?
That's a very good point.
That to me is a serious inconsistency. So you've got the issue with writing it down in Muhammad's lifetime, but you've also got the issue that the following 2 or 3 generations that were alive when he was around, so there would have been the next generation down, like his children's generation. So he's the first. He said the first 3 generations. Well, he's of the first generation. His children will be the second generation, and the grandchildren will be the 3rd generation. Yet not one of them had the presence of mind to write the Quran down, and you have to wait until several hundred years later for it to be written down, codified, burned copies that don't agree with a certain narrative that's being set up. This in itself is problematic. Just this alone.
Oh boy, we've got some very smart people here in the stream. Let's have a look. Most versions of the Quran are in the Nile, and Masih Shahzud says the Islamic world is broken into 2 parts: the Hafs and the Hafs-nots. Oh boy. Oh my god, that's so good. Well done. Catherine says, apologies for being late, no notification. That's weird. I put up the stream notice like 3 days ago. I mean, I did this, I think, on Thursday, so that's very odd. So, yeah, so let's have a look. So that is the 7, the 3, and the 4, right? The 7, the 3, and the 4. So, let's continue. Let's look at the 7, the 14, and the 9. So here's the 7, right? That's canonized by Ibn Mujahid, who died in 936. So this is 300 years after Mo dies. We've got these 7 versions canonized. Then you've got the transmitters selected by Al-Shatibi, Kalun, Warsh, Al-Bazi, Kunbul, Al-Duri, Al-Susi, and Hisham. These are all from the 800s and the 900s. Then you've got transmitted selected by Al-Shatibi, Ibn Dakwan, Shuba, Hafs. Oh my golly. Can you see when Hafs is selected? Al-Shatibi died in nearly 1200. Thunderous. Does that look a bit weird to you?
It's the whole setup is not consistent with logic.
So
I mean,
these.
this is.
Yeah.
One has to bear in mind. This is the words of Allah. You know, we're on about bringing people to salvation. If the Quran is supposed to be the word of Allah, then and it's going to be the last testimony of Allah to mankind, there could be no more of a greater privilege or responsibility than trying to record this book. And yet every generation thereafter for several hundred years has issues from trying to compile this together. This is serious.
So Hafs dies in. Yeah, no, agreed. I agreed. So this is Hafs dies in 796 apparently, which is what, 164 years after Mo dies, supposedly according to the standard Islamic narrative. I can't remember who the 14th one is, so forgive me. I forgot. I either didn't look it up or made a typo or erased it accidentally. So whatever. So Al-Shatibi. Now, why is a guy in nearly 1200 making up a new list? This is like 600 years after Mo. Well, what is this guy doing? 600 years later.
And what are they basing? What is he making his list on? I mean, it's not as if they've got a great library or an internet research tool or anything, is it?
No.
This would be, if you go back several hundred years to how you can compile literature together to formulate or to correlate or to collate, it's going to be a heck of a task because all you've got is physical copies to deal with, and you've got to locate them as well.
Yeah, I mean, so anyway, then you've got transmitters selected by Al-Jazari. Then a guy called Al-Jazari comes along, and he selects a few more. So we got these ones, and now, hey, but wait, there's more. Ibn Abu Jafar, Medina, 748. Isa ibn Wardan, 777. Ibn Jumaz, the 800s, well, in the 8th century. Then you have Yaqub al-Yamani, okay, from Yemeni, Basra, dies 821. Khalaf, Kufa, 844. Rauch, 849. Ruwais, 853. That's all of these are a couple of hundred years after Mo died, 140 to 200 years after Mo. And then there's a couple more, Ishaq and Idris, 900 and 905. And Al-Jazari comes from the 1420s. What are your thoughts on that?
Over 700 years later.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is nuts. So how much is 14 minus 6? It's like 800 years later. So nearly 800 years. I mean, good grief. So the readers are called the Qur'an. This little talk that I gave here by this guy, the readers, he mentions the Qur'an, right?
Falls under the umbrella of like lies to children, if that makes sense. That falls under the umbrella of like lies to children. That falls under the umbrella of like lies to children.
That's him talking about the single preservation, preservation of a single version of the Quran. Yes, it's like Doritos chips. We'll just make more. Exactly. So the readers are the Qur'an and the transmitters are the Ruwat. So they chose a transmitter, not even a reader. In the context of the Qira'at, right, variant readings of the Quran, there's a distinction between readers called the Qur'an and the transmitters, the Ruwat or the Rawi. The readers, the Qur'an, known as Qur'an, were prominent reciters of the Quran from the early centuries, typically 2nd to 3rd centuries. Are we using 3rd century Bibles or are we using 1st century Bibles, Thunderous?
We're using 1st century Bibles, and they're recorded by the people who either knew Jesus personally or knew the people who knew Jesus personally. So they got it firsthand from the witnesses.
Right. So isn't this weird that Allah's perfect speech, we don't have 1st century versions? And there were authorities in the recitation. And besides, as I go back here, remember, we're using this guy. This guy in 1200 decided that this guy from nearly 800 was the right guy to use for the Quran out of all of this list. I mean, that's just it's totally random. Yeah.
Is it fair to say as well? Because, I mean, the further forward in time they're going, it seems to be that they're getting more information as well. The further forward in time goes. So the information that was around during Muhammad's time doesn't seem to be as much information as what the information was in the 8th century, 9th century, 10th century. So where's this new information coming from then in order for them to have all these choices to select from?
Your guess is as good as mine. Exactly. So, yeah. So the most well-known readers are the 7 readers, the Al-Qura al-Sabah, whose recitations were canonized and accepted as authentic by Islamic scholars. These 7 readers, we've already mentioned their names, right? So, and the transmitters. So, Ruwat, or singular Rawi, were students or disciples who transmitted and preserved the recitations of the readers. Each of the 7 canonical readers had 2 primary transmitters who learned and transmitted their recitations. Do we know if that's even true? Who knows? Maybe they made it up. I mean, they just say so. The transmitters played a role in ensuring the accurate transmission of the readers' recitations by memorizing and passing them down through chains of narration, right? Called isnad. The narrations of the readers' recitations are known as the rawayat, singular, rawayya. Right, so Warsh and Hafs, back to these two again. Warsh and Hafs are not Qira'at readings themselves, but rather they are transmitters or a ruwat of a specific Qira'at. Now, if the Qira'at are canonical and authoritative, why did they choose a transmission rather than the Qira'at? Doesn't that make sense, Thunderous?
No, it doesn't. I'm just trying to figure out how would they know which one, what choices do they have? Because they're, by implication, they're making the statement when they're making the choice that this is the one that's in Allah's heaven. This is the uncreated speech. How would they know which is the uncreated speech between the choices that they've got?
Exactly. So, guys, we'll go until past, right? Another 10 minutes, and I'll call it a night. So, Warsh was a transmitter of the Qira'at readings of Nafi al-Madani, one of the 7 canonical readers of the Qur'an. Hafs was a transmitter of Asim al-Kufi. So, Madani would, I think, be Medina, the city of the Prophet, where he died. And Asim al-Kufi, this is Iraq, another one of the 7 canonical readers. The Qira'at are the methods of recitation established by prominent Quranic scholars in the early centuries, like Nafi and Asim. These had students or disciples who transmitted or preserved these recitations. Right? So Nafi and Asim were among the canonical Qurra, or readers, who established authoritative methods of reciting the Quran. So they had to establish authoritative methods because they didn't know which was the original single method. They still don't. They have no idea. Warsh and Hafs were prominent transmitters who supposedly accurately transmitted and passed down the recitations or the Qira'at of Nafi and Asim respectively through chains of narration. So now the differences between Warsh and Hafs, while minor, now remember this is the standard claim, and we've shown that there are differences. There's differences in actual wording and meaning. They mean completely different things. The grammar is different. The tenses are different, right? So this is a result of them transmitting the distinct recitations of two different canonical readers, right? Any comments before I go on?
No, I was just thinking that, wow, to myself there, that the Bible, 66 books written down by 39 different men over a period of 1,600 years. They record everything down as soon as they're seeing it, more or less, with the exception of one or two books that are written by eyewitnesses of the witnesses. You would have thought Allah would have probably learned a lesson from that and not to trust oral tradition. You would have thought Allah would have been smart enough to figure out that there's going to be issues when you've got 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8, 9, 10, or 14 people recording something in a manner, right, that's going to contradict another person's statement because it's not being written down.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is an interesting question. I mean, first of all, you got from the people in the first century that walked and talked with and knew Jesus and no time for folklore, not 600 years separation like Muhammad and Islam, which is folklore. Yes. And Catherine M. says, however, their so-called chain is not a legal chain of custody required to establish truth in the court of law, correct? Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think there's no evidence unless you believe the words of the scholars, just like that, which you must do if you're a good Muslim. So yeah, I mean, there's no solid evidence.
Just on the comment from Andy, I mean, this is something I was going to mention later on, that when you consider that it took Allah 23 years or 24 years through the angel gibberish to reveal this uncreated speech of Allah in heaven, that's eternal, which is, as we've discussed before, is a situation of its a discussion on its own, uncreated speech. And there's no other book in Allah's heaven, just this one. It takes 24 years for Muhammad to receive it. But when we look at the contents are already of folklore that had already pre-existed Muhammad's birth. There's nothing new in this book. Right. Unless you're considering 1/4 of the Quran is just about Allah ranting about hell and how he's going to torture people, or there happened to be, as in words of Aisha, convenient surah to suit Muhammad's needs at that one particular time. There's nothing new in there. Okay, there's nothing to learn from. There's nothing to profit from. Yeah, so what I don't understand is why would it take 24 years for a book to be revealed that's only going to reveal stories that had already been in pre-existing times, well, that had already existed before Muhammad was even born? Do you not sense an issue with that?
That's a very good point. Yeah. FM Knight says they try to imitate Christianity but fail to uphold the truth. Yes. Roland Kallenberg says, can someone please confirm that Muhammad's Sirah was lost and was only recently found in a library in Germany? So Roland, the story is not quite that. A German scholar had fragments of different manuscripts that are the Sirah, or the biographies of Muhammad. Technically, it's actually the Gospels of Muhammad. It's an equivalent of the Gospels, the stories of Muhammad from his companions, and it's a record of Muhammad's miracles, which somehow don't appear in the Quran. And I've done many shows on the Sirah. If you look in my search my channel, you're going to find, and it's incredible, Muhammad basically becomes Muhammad Jesus. He is not the son of God, but the partner of Allah. He's made from the same spirit as Allah. Allah takes a piece of himself and drops Muhammad on the planet, and there's Mo, off he goes, and Mo is effectively Allah. Mo is a deity, quite bluntly. So this scholar found fragments and assembled those fragments into the Sirah, apparently. That Jay Smith does a talk on this recently. He did so about 2 weeks ago on Sirah International. So have a look at that. He explains that. And but the Sirah are still late. They come 200, 250 years after Muhammad. And if the Sirah are still being written today, still being embellished today, and there's no evidence, and you can see it's basically Bible plagiarism. It's really just a false teaching. When you read the Sirah, go through my videos. I've got numerous talks on them. It is Muhammad becomes a deity. Muhammad becomes a god, and he becomes Jesus effectively.
Go on. Can I just add on to that, if I may? You did a fantastic discussion a couple of years ago about Muhammad being the light in heaven.
Yes.
That all the prophets that came before Muhammad actually had a piece of Muhammad's light before Muhammad himself turned up. And that in itself raises some alarming questions. But I don't want to digress, but fascinating discussion you did then.
we can revisit that because yeah, it doesn't hurt to revisit that because I've also learned more in the meantime, or I've done additional research. Now I've got more sources. I know more places to look. I can process the data better. I've got more tools, so it's possible to revisit and improve upon that. So Al-Shatibi's Al-Muwafaqat is a famous work on Quranic transmission. It has the 7 canonical readers, okay, selected by Ibn Mujahid, and here are the 14 transmitters for the 7 readers. Hafs, okay, transmitters Abdullah ibn Zubair, Ikrimah, Khalid al-Hadith, Abu Jafar al-Madani. So here you've got Ibn Kathir, right? Uthman ibn Affan, Abdullah ibn Maslama, Abu al-Aswad al-Duali, and Abdullah ibn Ubay. So there you go. So you can see all of the transmitters for the 7 readers. Okay, now Al-Shatibi's list is not exhaustive. Other scholars may have listed additional transmitters for these readers, but this list represents the core transmission chain for each of the 7 canonical readers as selected by Ibn Mujahid. So you've got 7 plus 14, that's 21, plus now you've got the 7 plus the 3 plus the 4, so that's 7 more, so that's 21, that's 28, and then the 7 more is another 14, that's 42. That's 42 versions of the Quran. Now let's have a look at the book of the 7 readings from Ibn Mujahid. Ibn Mujahid said people differed in reading the Qira'at, the Qur'an, just as they differed in legal rulings or ahkam. And transmitters of hadith differed about narrations of companions and their immediate followers. So he's telling us there were contradictions in people applying the Islamic Sharia. There were contradictions in people transmitting the hadiths. And I will cover the fact that even Bukhari has multiple Qira'at. So when you look at Bukhari, there are numerous versions of the same hadiths, and the selectors had to choose which one, because Bukhari was received from his student, and there was a compiler involved as well. So there's a multiple chain of what's that word? Catherine M used it. What's that?
Isnad.
No, not the Isnad chain. The chain of custody. There's a multiple chain of custody from Bukhari to what we have today, and someone had to pick and choose which one of Bukhari's stories, the variants, had to be selected. So even the hadiths have exactly the same problem that the Quran has. And he says in the book of 7 readings, people differed in reading the Quran. They differed in legal rulings, and they differed in the hadiths. So, and they differed about narrations of companions and their immediate followers. So from the very beginning, there was confusion as to what was the proper version of the Quran. So your thoughts on this?
No, I've got nothing to add on that other than just further confusion.
Yeah. So on Uthman's Quran, so Uthman is the 3rd caliph of Islam. He only canonized the razm, or the undotted skeletal text. So he did not have the dots that indicate the vowels and the different versions of the word. So there was no vowels and no dots. So in Arabic, the process of dotting, ijaz, is crucial for conveying the correct pronunciation of written texts. The original dotting scheme has not survived. Tradition recognizes 10 canonical ways to dot the Arabic text, besides many non-canonical ways of dotting the Arabic text, which will change the meaning of the razm, of the consonantal text. The percentage of agreement in dotting is high, but hundreds of variants exist among canonical Qira'at. At least 292 words, as according to Sidki. Sidki is this guy.
Or one Qur'an or something like that. And if I were to be very generous, I would say that falls under the umbrella of like lies to children, if that makes sense. That falls under the umbrella of like lies to children.
That's the same guy telling us at least nearly 300 versions, right? Words. Absence of a standardized original dotting scheme has led to a proliferation of variant readings and pronunciations, because different dotting schemes mean different vowels, mean different words. So there's even more confusion there. Of the 10 canonical Qira'at, only 7 were canonized by Ibn Mujahid, who admits confusion. We just saw that quote from him. In the 10th century, and he only created a new version by force. He had 7 versions. They couldn't come to one. They couldn't decide which one, so they had to use all 7, and he did so with government force and by beating people up with whips. He chose one from Mecca, Medina, Basra, and Damascus, but 3 from Kufa, Iraq, due to his familiarity with Kufan tradition, because that's where he was from. That's in Dutton, Orality, page 5. The last 3 were canonized in the 14th century by Al-Jazari. The 14th century. I know of a case where a new Bible was made in the 16th century. I know a case like that. There's a guy called, name starts with an M. It's not Mo, it's Ma, something like that. Yeah, where someone comes along in the 15th century, makes a new Bible. No historian like that. Then you've got Al-Jazari, 833, right? AH, which is our 1400s or whatever. And according to Marain van Putten, with the exception of Muhammad bin Surayh al-Ruwaini, who died in 476, that is in Muslim years, right? So that's the 12th century. Nobody considered the canonical readings mutawatir until the 7th century. Nobody considered the canonical readings mutawatir till the 7th century AH. So that would mean until the 14 or 1500s, our time. Your thoughts, Thunderous? No, 13th century. That would be the 13th century, our time. So it took 700 years for people to say that these canonical readings that were supposedly created, right, by Ibn Mujahid were canonical. No one believed that they were canonical or mutawatir.
Yeah, I've got no comments on that one, dude.
Yeah, I mean, this is incredible. Nobody considered the canonical readings mutawatir. In other words, the chain of custody, the isnads, are considered unreliable, not mutawatir, not reliable. So, word for word accurate. Effectively, Ronald Kardenberg, yes, mutawatir means it is fully authentic. It has an unbroken chain of transmission, a fully reliable, utterly believed, 100% accurate chain of transmission from the beginning. But nobody believed that until the 7th century of Islam. The 7th century of Islam would be, what, our 1200s, 1300s? So this is hundreds of years after the death of Muhammad. Isn't that significant, Thunderous?
This is the sort of stuff that I should imagine that Yasser Qadhi was saying, that we don't go beyond the line, or we don't talk about this in the public. This is the information he's probably got access to that he doesn't want other people to realize.
Yeah. So yeah, in the 9th century, Ibn Jazari still rejects that they are mutawatir. So the guy who created the 7 canonized versions, Ibn Mujahid in the 9th century, still rejects that they are mutawatir. Otherwise, there'd be one single version, one mutawatir version. Although that view had become typical between the 7th to 9th centuries. So already in the 7th century, everyone was like, yeah, we don't believe this is mutawatir. We've got these versions are all valid. All of these different versions are valid. Shadi Nasr talks about this in the transmission of the variant readings of the Qur'an. We'll touch on his work in the next show. So I'll pause here. Quran variations was normal. Orality, literacy, and the 7 akhruf, hadith, right? Yasin Dutton. The well-known hadith that the Quran was revealed according to 7 akhruf indicates that a certain amount of variation in the Quran was considered legitimate, normal in the earliest days of Islam. Your final word to you, Thunderous, and we'll call it a day here.
No, I've got nothing to add on that. The statement in the headline, speaks for itself, and pretty much confirms everything that you've been saying, right or wrong. That it's not just one person making this observation; it's several people making the conversation to the same effect.
Yeah, and I like what he says here. It took hundreds of years to subdue the opposition and take control by force.
Yeah, I just want to go through a couple of questions I've made from people in the chat. Says, did Momo exist? He says, I mean, Robert Spencer said that there is no real historical records. I think I think you and I have discussed this before, and my own personal opinion is if I'm listening to somebody that says Muhammad didn't exist, I tend to go with it. And then when I listen to somebody who says that Muhammad did exist, I tend to go with it. It depends what mood I'm in that determines whether I believe Muhammad existed or not. What's your thoughts, Lloyd?
He seems to be a composite. I don't think there was one Muhammad. It seems to be a composite of different figures. There might have been a Muhammad figure that was an inspiration, but I think there were more than one. To establish a single Muhammad is very difficult, and I think slowly over time we're starting to piece together. We're finding the internet, as you mentioned, is the death of Islam. We are finding new information that is slowly starting to reveal how Islam was constructed, and it is a construction. In fact, scholars in the 1700s, 1800s, German and English scholars had already started to say these things. So they had already said the things that we're saying now. In fact, we're just reverting to scholarship pre-World War II and 1700s, 1800s. So we're just rediscovering views from then.
See, the things that sometimes that make me lead me towards that he is a real person is when you consider the fact that it was a woman, Khadija, that was responsible for him becoming a prophet, and then his actions afterwards were that he condemned basically Muslim women for the next 1400 years. So there are certain little incidences like that, or the whole Aisha or Zainab. They for me sort of give evidence that he was a real person.
Agreed, there was a person, but also, look, we know the Quran was still being constructed and the Hadith were being constructed hundreds of years later, which means, and we know they were changing these things for their agendas. So I would say there were insertions over hundreds of years. We know the Sharia was still being created in the 1500s.
And I would agree with you on that. So if I was to go with it, I wouldn't go with one person. I would go with several people or no person.
Yeah. Yes. So it doesn't make sense. Yeah. Go on.
King's Face Palms reads, asks, Quran is like the old English nursery rhymes that have messages hidden in the story for contemporaries to know, but people in the future might interpret differently. Well, I would challenge that statement. I don't think they are nursery rhymes. What they are just bastardized stories from pre-existing literature that was around it. For example, there's nothing to learn from, the Bible says 10 plagues were inflicted on Egypt. The Quran says 9. The Bible says all the sons of Noah survived the flood. The Quran says no one drowned. There's nothing to learn as far as some kind of traditional story there. It's making a historical statement that's inaccurate. Like the Bible teaches Jesus died. The Quran says Jesus didn't. So I would disagree with you that a hidden message in there. There's no hidden message in there. It's a historical statement. And the other stories, well, they're from sort of like local stories that pre-existed in Arabia at the time, like Dul Qarnayn, for instance. There's no hidden message in that. It's a historical statement in Islamic recension.
Right. Yeah, I'll just finish off on this. Thank you. Roland Kallenberg says, I don't think he existed as a single human being. That's my thinking. Yes, I don't think he existed. An early Dread Pirate Roberts type. What's Dread Pirate? I know the story, but I don't know enough about it. But merely Dave says, Lloyd, you'll be recorded in the annals. That's the annals. Annals is 2 N's. Of these times as being one of the most important contributors to the reinstatement of the Christian Logos. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Mo was a composite, agreed. Even his composite is a minuscule element of the picture we have. Mo is largely the imagination and construct by various caliphs and religious leaders over a few hundred years. That's probably true. Early Islam or pre-Islam, the caliphs were more important than Mo, hence we have less positive hadiths on Mo. Yeah, I mean, he was in a tug of war. This idea, this concept of Mo, they constructed this idea of him. And the Sirah paints him as a completely fictitious Jesus character. But yeah, I'll call it a night here. Thunderous, final word to you again. Princess Bride Infamy, yes.
I just want to thank you. Thank you for allowing me to come on your show and have this discussion with this evening. I'd like to thank the audience for being a part of the show. Thank you for the questions in the chat and your comments. Lloyd said a couple of positive things about me a couple of weeks ago and maybe last week and this week. And I'd just like to say, upon meeting Lloyd in person, Lloyd and myself have known each other for several years now. We met on a previous show. We hit it off straight away pretty well. We lost contact for a period of time, and then we got back in contact together through another channel, Thaddeus on Reasoned Answers. Well, I'd like to give a big shout out for Thaddeus for getting Lloyd and myself back together again. And Lloyd is probably one of the most generous and gracious people I've ever met. I say that sincerely. Thoroughly enjoy his company, and what he is on the show, how he speaks, how he presents himself, considering his background and what his abilities are in his former employments. He comes across as he is a genuine, nice, generous person. And a big shout out to Lloyd for all the hard work that you put in. I think Chris said something about what I've been saying for many years, and I've said it privately in our private chats, that no one does what you do. You cover so many bases with Islam and atheism and other subjects, but no one does it as uniquely as you do. You're not repetitive. You don't sort of like do formula. You really go in deep and provide information that no one else has ever considered before or knew existed. And the way you present it together shows that you've got a natural ability to teach people. And I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you. That's high praise. Thank you, Thunderous. Coming from you, that's really high praise. So thank you. So guys, thank you. I'll be back with Thunderous next weekend. Are we good for next weekend? Saturday, probably, Thunderous, you think?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, sounds good. So guys, I will be on, hopefully on Tuesday with Eric from Cross and Crescent discussion group, and then again Saturday with Thunderous. And yeah, we'll do some more stuff. Thanks, guys. Hopefully you've learned something. Use the information. And God bless. We'll see you guys all soon. Take care. Bye.